Well, I think one of the first things that we want to tackle here, given the fact that this is a product of the 18th century and we just came off talking about the Enlightenment, we're talking about the Federalist period and so on. One of the interesting things about the Federalist period, talking about late 1790s all the way to the 1820s, is it sort of bridges the Enlightenment to the Romantic movement in the United States anyway, right? Remember we talked about the fact that the Romantic movement starts earlier in Britain than it does in the United States. Most people don't really start talking about Romanticism in America until the 1830s. You have a number of different writers. We talked about the reasons for this. A number of the different writers, Washington Irving and James Fenimore Cooper and so on, of the Federalist period, who are in some cases, right, Legend of Sleepy Hollow and these kind of Rip Van Winkle, these sorts of tales, tales in the wilderness and dark villains and these kinds of things, are exhibiting sort of quasi-Gothic sorts of things in their writings. But the Romanticism doesn't really get going until the 1830s. So we have a sort of a 2 to 3 decade period there in the United States that we call the Federalist period, where a lot of the writings are sort of swinging back and forth between this newer emphasis on Gothicism and emotion and feeling, and they're choosing nature, certainly in many cases, especially Cooper, as their backdrop, something you would associate with Romanticism. And yet there are many other kinds of Enlightenment attributes and assumptions, particularly with Cooper. James Fenimore Cooper is thoroughly an Enlightenment guy. He's not a romantic at all, but he's presaging Romanticism in a lot of different regards. We'll save that for another class, but it's a thing to think about. Wieland, with Charles Brockden Brown and his novel, is very much in the Federalist position, or Federalist tradition, I should say, but it's raising questions about the approach to reality and cognition and human behavior and all those sorts of things that the Enlightenment sort of took as gospel. Right? So there's a tension here, naturally, between the rational and the supernatural. Let's look at a few places where you can see that. First, you can begin with Clara and Theodore Wieland's dad. Kind of a religious nut, to be honest with you. I mean, he thinks the world's coming to an end. He builds a temple out in the middle of nowhere, thinking he's going to convert the Indians, and then dies by what we can only assume is spontaneous combustion. Just boom, clap, and puff of smoke, and there he goes. That is a thing that in the novel is still kind of left up in the air. There's some ambiguity about it, but the clear insinuation is Charles Brockden Brown wants us to think that maybe it could have happened, right? And by the way, spontaneous combustion, you can Google this. It has its detractors and its critics and its skeptics. However, there have been some cases of combustion. There just have. Don't ask me to explain the science behind it, but it certainly has happened. I think there have to be some very specific chemical and sort of atmospheric conditions, but evidently it is possible for a human being to just kind of go up like a Roman candle. That would have been an enormous oddity. That would have been something that would have been a real head-scratcher back in the 18th century. And, of course, Brown uses that to his full advantage to kind of shock and awe and everything, to get people to pay some attention to what he's trying to do, sensationalize, if you will. Now, Wieland himself is sort of put up against Pleyel, however you want to pronounce it, as a kind of a foil, or maybe vice versa, it depends. Pleyel is clearly the more rational thinker, he's the skeptic. Clara actually has a kind of intellectual sympathy for him. Obviously, she's got feelings for him, right? And when the report is that his girlfriend back in Europe is dead, then she's not dead, then she's dead again, or what have you. It's hard to follow the narrative thread, but she is clearly enamored of him and admires that aspect of him, whereas Wieland exhibits some of the sort of mystic fascination with the supernatural that his father did, although not completely buying into it. Clara seems to me to be sort of stuck in the middle between these two, and that makes her a very interesting character because she's the one through whose eyes we're seeing all of this, and it's in a sort of a kind of epistolary mode where we get to see sort of her changing attitude, her changing belief system. She's being pulled in both directions. Do I believe in scientific explanation, logic, reason, rhetoric, or do I believe in that which cannot be expressed through words? Well, certainly she's being exposed to a lot of things that are happening that are apparently beyond explanation. Although, at the end, you know, there's reason for us to believe that all of these things, the biloquism and all of these, the hypnosis or mesmerism, mesmer hadn't come along yet, by the way, but that's kind of a precursor, the sort of being transfixed into a zombie-like state, the way Wieland is, to go and do horrific deeds, being under the power or mastery of some other person, spontaneous combustion. They all seem to have kind of a scientific explanation at the end, if you want to believe that way. So I think he's trying to give us some sort of sense of identifying with Clara, not knowing what to believe. Should we have faith in science? Should we have faith in something else? What should it be? Along this line, this sort of Lockean assumption about all of our knowledge, the epistemological school of thought known as empiricism, is questioned as well, because throughout the novel in different passages, and I'll just point out a couple of them for you, we are told that the senses can't be trusted. After all, this is about somebody throwing his voice and fooling people into thinking they heard what maybe they didn't hear, or hearing something or somebody that turns out to be different. So the question in the novel that comes up is, can we trust our senses? And that's a very important question, because if Locke and others believe that everything we know through our senses, but then we find out we can't trust our senses, then everything we know or think we know, we can't really trust, right? So you see the latent or inherent skepticism involved. This is just, I'm going to pull this out of here in chapter 4, towards the end, about a page towards the end. I said this man is of an ardent and melancholy character, those ideas which in others are casual or obscure, which are entertained in moments of abstraction and solitude and easily escape, etc., etc. The language is really something else. She says, the will is the tool of the understanding, which must fashion its conclusions on the notices of sense. If the senses be depraved, it is impossible to calculate the evils that may flow from the consequent deductions of the understanding. So there, Brown is basically saying, if you don't have the right ability to perceive through the senses, right? If they're defective somehow, then how are you going to learn, right? So he sets up the paradox there, or what have you. Then again, a little bit later on, you can see here that Clara, in some of their conversations and debates, exhibits some skepticism about what we can know or what we can't know. His fancy was eminently vigorous and prolific, and if he did not persuade us that human beings are sometimes admitted to a sensible intercourse with the author of nature, he at least won over our inclination to the cause. Clara is a bit of a religious skeptic here, and believes in the senses, and yet what's going to fool her are her senses, you see. A little later in the novel, if I can find the spot here. This is in chapter 15, about a page or so into it. Notice what also we see here. He went into his chamber, and after some interval I stole across the entry and down the stairs with inaudible steps. Having secured the outer doors, I returned with less circumspection. He heard me not when I descended, but my returning steps were easily distinguished. Now, he thought, was the guilty interview at an end. In what other way was it possible for him to construe these signals? Right? And he talks about the artless narratives and so on and so forth. So she admits that the basis of her understanding of all of human reason and knowledge is faulty, right? Because we can't necessarily trust our senses. Later, another passage real quickly, and this is in chapter 16, paragraph that begins with, the intimation was imperfect. Might I not trust to the same issue? This idea might possess through imperceptibly some influence. I persisted, but it was not merely on this account. I cannot delineate the motives that led me on. I now speak as if no remnant of doubt existed in my mind as to the supernatural origin of these sounds, but this is owing to the imperfection of my language. For I mean only that the belief was more permanent and visited more frequently my sober meditations than its opposite. Okay? So she distrusts the existence of the supernatural also, and it gets her into trouble because she doesn't have the ability to base her knowledge on something that's absolutely fundamentally reliable. Finally, towards the end of the end of the novel, at one point she says, for a moment I doubted whether my remembrance of the events were not confused. How could he be at once stationed at my shoulder and shut up in the closet? How could he stand near me and yet be invisible? But if Carwin's were the thrilling voice and the fiery visage which I had heard and seen, then was the promoter. Then was he the promoter of my brother and the author of these dismal outrages. And it goes on and on throughout the novel. So if the senses can't be trusted, nothing we know can be trusted. So we it's a sort of view of nihilism in a way. So the question is then, what is Charles Brockden Brown saying about reason and intuition, reason and faith? And the second question that's just as important, I think, remember that the subtitle of the novel is The Transformation, an American tale. So what's American about it, and what sorts of transformations? Clearly, Carwin transforms, does he not? Over time, he's kind of a morphing figure throughout the novel. You can't quite get a finger on whether he's a good guy, bad guy, something in between, somebody who's misunderstood. Towards the end, he has to offer this explanation. She simply rejects it and says, just out of hand, that he's just not to be believed. Clearly, Wieland transforms into a psychotic killer who kills everybody just about. Stay away from him. He's out of his mind. How can that happen? How can rational beings be so thoroughly manipulated by something which is inexplicable? How can they be done? Though the answer is, if you manipulate their sense perceptions, you can manipulate their psychology. And if you can manipulate their psychology, you can transform them into something they're not. And guess what? If these guys are susceptible to it, so are you and I, right? So I think Brown is trying to say that reason is something that, when it's working, is fine. But if the basis of rational thought, i.e. sensory knowledge, is unreliable, then we're back to square zero, right? Not even square one, but square zero, because we know nothing. If what we perceive through our senses can't be trusted, then the knowledge that we build based on our senses can't be trusted. And so, but then again, shall we follow intuition? Old man Wieland did that, went out into the wilderness and, well, lived and died, and doesn't seem to have solved the great mysteries and mystic religious questions that he was going after. And then, as soon as we're willing to believe in supernatural kind of boogeymen, we find out that if you open the closet, it's just a dude named Carwin, who just happens not to have some magical power, but has learned a trick, sort of a carnival barker's trick. So at the end of the day, I think Brown's trying to ask the question, what can we base knowledge on? Can we base it on reason, or can we base it on intuition? Because both of them are flawed or faulty. Neither one of them is able to give us the kind of rock-solid understanding of the world around us. So the skepticism here is implicit.